Hello and welcome back to the channel. As another book review. Now, if I sound a little hoarse, it's because I currently, as I'm filming this, have a really bad cough. So if I pause, or if you see that there's a jump cut, it's more likely because I've been coughing. Now, as you can tell by the title and the thumbnail, I am once again doing another book review. Except I'm not reviewing one book. I am reviewing three books. Yes. I have decided to, for the 25th anniversary of the saga of Darren Shan being started with Cirque du Freak, have decided it's about time I revisit this franchise. So instead of doing one book a month, for a year, I'm going to break it down into different arcs because that's essentially what it is as well. Now there are many different names for the arcs. I am calling this the Cirque du Freak arc, because it somewhat centers around the Cirque du Freak for the three books. The Cirque du Freak and the Vampire's Assistant does take place a lot around the Cirque du Freak, and only the beginning part of Tunnels of Blood centers around it. So I'm going to do it that way, and then I'm going to do the Vampire Mountain arc, which is Vampire Mountain, Trials of Death, and the Vampire Prince. And that'll be the Hunters arc, which is Hunters of the Dusk, Allies of the Night, and Killers of the Dawn. And then it's the Sons of Destiny arc, which is the Lake of Souls, Lord of Shadows, and Sons of Destiny. So yeah, that's just the way I've decided to break up this review. So starting off with the very first book, Cirque du Freak. So this is, of course, the 25th anniversary artwork that was released for this book, and I keep forgetting just how much I end up enjoying this book more when I reread it because, if I haven't touched it in a couple of years, I'll say to myself, I usually remember everything that happens, a lot of the stuff that happens in these books, and I keep thinking to myself, oh yeah, Cirque du Freak is good. The same with the Vampire's Assistant, but I kind of need to, fly through them in order to get into the good stuff, the nitty gritty stuff, from Tunnels of Blood onwards. But they're still good books in their own regard. So what is Cirque du Freak about? Well, there's these four boys, Darren, Steve, Tommy, and Alan. And one day, Alan brings in a peculiar flyer for a freak show. And so they get tickets, only two. And so in the end, it's Darren and Steve that goes to the freak show. And they have a wonderful time. There's so many different interesting freaks. So we've got Ramus Two Bellies, who can eat anything. He does have two bellies. There is Hans Hands, who can, he puts his legs behind his head and he can run faster than any man could on two legs. And then, there's Madame Turska, who is the bearded lady. And, Everett, the snake boy. And then the wolf man. And then lastly is the main man himself, Mr. Crepsley, and his amazing poisonous spider, Madame Octa. Now, the thing with both Darren and Steve is Darren is obsessed with spiders, loves them, absolutely loves them. His parents, however, won't let him have any more because when they bought him a really expensive tarantula and he was watching Saturday morning cartoons, he got the bright idea to suck up his tarantula, thinking that it was going to be okay. It was not okay. And the thing with Steve is he loves the horror, the macabre, and he recognized Crepsley straight away from an old painting from 1903, back when Crepsley used to be known as Verhorsten, which in the sequel series, The Saga of Darren and Crepsley, comes very important, which of course I will cover at some point. And so Steve decides to stay back after the freak show and try to ask Mr. Crepsley to make him into a vampire. That does not go well. Darren also witnesses this and becomes a bit standoffish. Eventually, just before the Cirque du Freak disembarks, he goes and steals Madame Octa. And, he's controlling her. Not as well as Mr. Crepsley is, but to a degree. Eventually, in that time, Darren and Steve, they kind of drift apart, but then Steve comes over, um, finds out that Darren did, of course, see him talking to the vampire, and shows them Madame Octa, and then Darren's sister comes in, sees the spider, didn't know the spider was a thing, screamed her head off, and the spider bit Steve, because Madame Octa has been trained to knock someone out on the first bite, but the second bite is what's going to kill you. So thankfully, the Madame Octa didn't get to do the second bite, but Darren, after coming back from the hospital where Steve is, throws Madame Octa out of the window in pure frustration, not thinking, and just before it can even crash land, outstretches a hand of one Mr. Crepsley. And so, of course, he knew where she was the entire time. And so Darren goes to try and get Mr. Crepsley to save Steve. But he'll do it on one condition, and that is if Darren becomes the vampire's assistant. Now, what I love about these vampires in these books is Darren Shan, the author, gives it his own spin. We find out that there's half vampires, so you're not made a full vampire straight away. So half vampires still get to enjoy the daylight. They can go walk about, no problem. However, they'll age incredibly slow. So for a half vampire, they'll age 1 year for every 5 that's passed. And a full vampire ages 1 year for every 10 years that passes. And of course, they can go out in the sun, but not for long. Otherwise, they'll get a really bad sunburn, and then they'll eventually kill them. But there's stuff like crosses, holy water, garlic, bunch of hooey compared to them. So Darren reluctantly agrees, because gets blooded. Steve is saved. Darren leaves, runs away from Mr. Crepsley. Some more stuff happens. Darren drinks the blood of his friend, almost drinks the blood of his sister, and then goes crawling back to Mr. Crepsley a second time, and then they fake his death, and then they go on their way. And that's the end of the first book. I like it. It is the book that started it all. However, for what comes next, it's not the greatest compared to the other books in this franchise, but I still love it nonetheless. There's a reason I reread this series every few years, because I love it that much. So now we move on to the second book in the series, and that is The Vampire's Assistant. So I should have also mentioned these 3 books, Cirque, The Vampire's Assistant, and Tunnels of Blood, did get turned into a movie. I did do a video review of it a little while ago, like maybe 2 years ago or something like that, back when I used to script my videos. So that's dating it there. Had to pause there for a cough. So what is The Vampire's Assistant about? Well, we picked back up where we last left off, and Darren is refusing to drink human blood. He's holding out on his humanity, because at the end of the last book, he faked his death in order to go traveling with Crepsley. And so, they're moving from place to place. During the day, he goes out and he interacts with some human boys playing some hockey, and ends up breaking some poor lad's 2 legs. Like, you can see bone and all, and he's depressed. He misses his family, he misses his friends, and above all else, he's stuck with the person who stole his life from him. So of course he hates Crepsley for that. And so Crepsley thinks about it, and it's like, well, how about we go back to the Cirque du Freak? There will be people there his age, so it'll keep him busy during the day. Of course he'll have to pitch in and all that. And so they agree, and they head to the Cirque du Freak. And so that's what happens. Darren ends up bunking with Evra, the snake boy that I mentioned earlier on, and the two of them become thick as thieves. And whilst they were also doing that, they meet a human boy named Sam Grest. And Sam is very interested about this freak show and would love to join. And then they also meet somebody else who is a member of NOP, who is an eco warrior named RV, or Reggie Veggie if you want to go that way. And so Darren is still refusing to drink human blood. He'll drink animal blood, no problem. But it's one of the days that they're hanging out with Sam after they've done the chores that the little people show up. Now, I did mention the little people in my when I was talking about Cirque du Freak because they weren't really that necessary. But we don't know much about these little people. All we know is they wear blue hoods, and they don't speak, and they eat like a truck. Like they'll eat anything. And we learn a story of a previous performer who went missing and ended up being little people chow food. And they literally ate him alive. And then we also get introduced to a very mysterious character that has ever shaken to the bones and has everybody in camp on edge. That person's name is a Mr. Desmond Tiny. But people often call him Des Tiny. And what happens when you put his name, his first shortened first name and last name together? You get Mr. Destiny. And so Mr. Destiny summons both Evra and Darren to Mr. Tall, who is the owner of the circus, and asks that Darren and Evra be the one in charge of acquiring the little people's food. So they agree, and he leaves. Then a performer known as Cormac Limbs returns. His special gimmick is he can cut any bit off of him, except for his head. He hasn't tried that yet, and it'll grow back. Cuts off fingers, hands, legs, arms. It grows back instantly, and he only feels pain for a minute of a second. And so then, with Cormac back, they decide to finally put on a show. And it's here where Darren gets tickets for RV and Sam. This would bite Darren in the ass not long after this. So they enjoy the show. Mr. Crepsey brings Darren on stage because of his previous experience with Madame Octa, and Darren thinks for a second that he could kill Mr. Crepsey. Just send one signal to Madame Octa and then bye-bye vampire. But he doesn't. And then Mr. Crepsey mentions this because there was a test to see if Darren would do it, and he's annoyed. Afterwards, Sam loved it. Still wants to join the Cirque du Freak. However, RV, after seeing the Wolfman and the goat that was killed by Madame Octa, isn't too happy. And so some more stuff happens. But eventually, during the last performance, before they move on, RV goes skulking about and accidentally lets the Wolfman free. But before the Wolfman gets freed, RV loses his hands and goes running off screaming. Who knows if that'll be the last of him? Obviously, if you read the books, you know it isn't. But for those who don't, I'm trying to build up suspense. Anyway, then the Wolfman gets out and sets his eyes on Sam. Now, Darren spun a wild tale to keep Sam from joining, because Mr. Crepsey was only going to let Sam join if Sam became a half vampire. If Darren told him about vampires, half vampires, and asked if he would become Mr. Crepsey's assistant. Darren doesn't want that, and so he comes up with a cockamamie story. But then the Wolfman makes chase. Darren catches up. They try to fend off the Wolfman. It doesn't go well. Darren gets knocked out, and by the time he comes to, Sam is nearly dead. The Wolfman has been chomping on him. And so, as a last-ditch effort to save Sam, Darren drinks him dry. Because we learn some interesting lore throughout this book, that the vampires, they do believe in gods, and they do believe in this place called paradise on the other side of the universe. And that if you live a good life, you'll go to paradise. Very Klingon of the vampires, which I'll make mention shortly. But when a vampire drains a human dry, they absorb part of that person's spirit from going on to paradise. So that's how Darren saves Sam, essentially. He saves a part of his soul within his own. And then Darren starts to drink blood. And so all of this is literally the span of maybe a month or two for these two books. But then we get into my personal favorite of all the books. And there's a special story behind that. And that is Tunnels of Blood. Now, I've already spent 15 minutes going over two books, so I'm going to try to condense this story as quickly as possible. It's been a year and a half since the events of The Vampire's Assistant. An old friend of Mr. Krebsley shows up, a Governor Pearl, and informs Mr. Krebsley of some dire news that has him leave the Cirque to frequent Darren and Evra, the snake boy, for a time. And what is he looking for? Well, he's going back to, Mr. Krebsley is going back to his old city, the city of his birth, where he lived 200 odd years ago. And the reason is because there's something brewing. Now, Darren gets a girlfriend named Debbie Hemlock, and after a date, he comes back and Evra is as white as a ghost and asks Darren to check the news. Why? Because 6 bodies have been found, all drained of blood. And so, of course, the only logical conclusion that they do have is that that was Mr. Krebsley's doing, that he drained these poor innocent souls dry. And so they start to stalk him. And just before Mr. Krebsley makes a strike, Darren strikes and fucks it up. Because it turns out Krebsley wasn't the one draining them dry. Oh no, it was somebody else. Someone with purple skin and red ruby lips, as well as red eyes. There are more vampires, except these aren't called vampires. These are called the Vampanese. Yes, Darren Shan, the author, has put a massive spin on vampires in this book. So I already made mention that Darren Shan's vampires, you can be a half vampire before becoming a full vampire. You age 1/5 for every 1 year for every 5 that passes if you're half vampire. You age 1 for every 10 years when you're full vampire. Vampires in this book series don't drain a person dry. They only take what they need to survive, which is just a little drops here and there. Vampanese, however, are somewhat similar, but absolutely not. The Vampanese, when the laws were being brought in for vampires to limit the amount that they drink, 70 vampires hated that. They wanted to stick to the old traditions. And so they broke off from the clan and became known as the Vampanese. And so they are the ones that drain the victims dry. And of course, over the years of doing that, they develop purple skin, red eyes, red ruby lips, and so on and so forth. And we learn that there was a war between the two vampire clans, but eventually they came to a peace treaty. We also learn slightly more about, the vampire hierarchy. We know that these people called the vampire generals, and we know that there are these things called the vampire princes who oversee everything. So you have the princes, the generals, and then the regular vampires in the clan. And so this Vampanese is named Murlaw. And Murlaw, after having his feed interrupted by Darren running into Mr. Krebsley, thinking that Mr. Krebsley was the one who was drinking these people dry, steals Evra, kidnaps Evra. And so Darren comes up with a plan to save him. He allows himself to get captured, offers his girlfriend up to save Evra, and tricks Murloc, and then Mr. Crepsley kills him. And that is the end of the book. They go back to the Cirque du Freak. Now, why is Tunnels of Blood so special to me? Well, I am dyspraxic. Well, I'm dyslexic and dyspraxic. But I years and years ago, when I first picked up this book, 10, 15 years ago now, I could barely read because there would be certain words that I just did not know. I didn't know how to pronounce. And so I hated reading for the longest time until I read this book. Until I sat down and read Tunnels of Blood. So yes, when I first read through the Saga of Darren Shan, I read them out of order. I think by the time I finally finished them out of order, Vampire Mountain was the last one that I read for me to have read all of them at that point. Sorry, had a sneeze there. And so through reading Tunnels of Blood, I fell in love with reading. And so then I went out and read all the other books. And then, I did the same with his other series, the Demonata. I read those out of order as well. But after the Demonata, like for his zombie series and the Archibald Locke series, I read those in order. So it's only the first two series that he done that I read out of order. But yeah, I love these books. I love returning to them. Just because I love vampires in general. I've always loved vampires ever since I was a kid. I get that from my mother. My mother was obsessed with vampires. And thus, she passed that on to me. I love these books. And I love for me, Tunnels of Blood on is where shit really gets good. But that doesn't mean that I don't love, the Cirque du Freak or the Vampire's Assistant. They are good books on their own. They're more standalone, really. You do need to read this in order to understand this, but the thing with Darren does is they always has a prologue at the beginning of every book after Cirque du Freak that explains the bit. So if that's the first book that you read, he can explain, he in the prologue, he explains it all. But yeah, Tunnels of Blood onwards for me, I absolutely love and adore. So I would highly recommend. Now, granted, these are for young adults. But still, I absolutely love these books. I love coming back to them. So that's why when I seen the 25th anniversary artwork, I knew I had to have it. Because I have 3 different copies of Cirque du Freak at this point. But yeah, that has been my review of the Cirque du Freak arc in the Saga of Darren Shan. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Let me just see what review I have coming next. I think it's a discussion video that I have coming next. I forget which one. But anyway, that is going to wrap it up for me. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you all on the very next upload.